Hello and welcome. How much should a country be willing to sacrifice its natural environment in the name of economic progress? In the case of Peru, the debate has led to violent clashes between indigenous peoples of the country and the government, which plans to expand a multi-billion-dollar energy and mining industry on their lands. Well, Peru's tourism capital, Cusco, witnessed a day of protests as hundreds of tribespeople converged on the town high in the Andes Mountains near Machu Picchu, threatening to disrupt a local festival. They're insisting that the government of President Alan Garcia heed their demands for more control over their ancestral lands and for real benefits for the profits that have flowed from international development of the areas. There have been a number of protests, some turning violent in the past few months. 2 weeks ago, at least 34 people are reported to have died during a violent encounter between police and local demonstrators near the Amazon town of Bagua. The government says most of those killed were police officers, a claim disputed by the demonstrators. The simmering protests have also taken a toll on the rule of President Alan Garcia, whose approval rating has dropped 9 points in the last month to a low of 21%. And Prime Minister Yuhide Simon has said he will step down soon in response to opposition demands. Well, last week, Peru's Congress revoked recent land reform laws aimed at opening more indigenous areas to international energy and mining developers, but the tribespeople remain unconvinced. On today's show, we look at both sides of the argument and ask, how can Peru and its neighbours balance economic development with respect for native tribal lands? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE. You can enter the chat room and take part, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Well, our discussion's in two parts. First, to look at the arguments being put forward by the indigenous peoples of Peru, who say their lands are being lost to the international developers with no benefit to their tribes. Andrew Miller, an environmental and human rights campaigner for Amazon Watch, a Washington, D.C.-based non-profit organization, is joining me here in the studio. Andrew, good to have you with us.
Delighted to be here.
It can be very easy in the media, especially, to portray this as a simple black and white argument that, you know, there are indigenous people losing their land to sort of large, greedy multinational corporations and in cahoots with the government and so on. But I guess it's not really that simple. What's at the heart of this issue, and why has it really been off the media sort of watch for so long?
Well, I mean, as you've been saying, I mean, there has been this push to exploit Peru's natural resources, and it's a tremendously wealthy country in many ways: subsoil, oil and gas, precious hardwoods, metals, both in the Amazon, which is about half of the country, maybe 60%, and also in the Andean region. So particularly under the current president Garcia, but under previous presidents also, there's been this real push towards extracting those resources and using them for economic development. But what that's in part led to is a rise in social conflicts with local communities, both in the Andes and the Amazon. And unfortunately, the Defensoría del Pueblo, the sort of human rights ombudsman within Peru, has been tracking these, and we've seen just in the last year or so that the social conflicts have more than doubled, and many of them have to do with what are socio-environmental issues. So these tensions are on the rise. Is
it that the indigenous people are not getting what they feel they deserve? Because they have actually been given millions of hectares of land which is supposed to be protected as well.
Right. Well, I mean, the indigenous people, there's been a process for them to demarcate their land and to get legal title. The reality is that what the government views as their legal lands and what the indigenous view as their lands are different. There's a different position there. The governments give a certain amount. The indigenous people see their ancestral lands as much broader than that, actually, and it is a significant area of land. But even once they're given those lands, there's still economic activities that can be carried out on those territories. And so what we see, Amazon Watch works a lot on oil and gas issues. And so we see that the oil companies come in, the government signs contracts with these companies, and they come in and they want to carry out exploration. There's a process, an environmental study that has to be carried out, and sort of a consultation process. But that consultation process happens at the end. All the major decisions have already been made, and communities are essentially being informed what is going to happen on their territory. And unfortunately, the benefits of that development are very much oversold at that stage, and there's very little discussion about what the negative environmental consequences and the negative social consequences are going to be. So indigenous communities often don't have the information that they need to really make a decision about whether or not they actually want this development to happen.
How has it turned so violent? How can you get to a stage where dozens of people are being killed and the country in areas has come to a standstill?
Well, indigenous people had been demonstrating for 2 months, essentially, before this incident happened in Bagua. And it's very important to mention that tens of thousands of indigenous people mobilized, and they, by and large, were nonviolent, were being peaceful. The indigenous leaders were calling for nonviolent protests. they carried, as you saw in the images, they carry spears, but that's really more ceremonial. I mean, they're not armed in any sense. So essentially the tensions had increased and increased, and then the government made a decision to clear the roads in Bagua. They sent in the police, and the information that we received from eyewitness testimonies is that the violence was essentially sparked by this police incursion. Protesters got hands on police weapons. They didn't have their own firearms. They got their hands on police weapons and fired back.
So that's essentially how, because the reports are that there were more police deaths in that incident than there were of the demonstrators.
Right. Well, there's this official figure that there were 23 police deaths and 10 civilians. That's the current figure. But the eyewitness testimonies that we captured on the ground, I have a colleague who was on the ground in Bagua the next day, and he and many media also, it's not just Amazon Watch, but many media have received testimonies that actually that there was an effort to cover up the number of deaths, and that there was an effort to dispose of bodies, to throw them in rivers and to burn them, etc. These are allegations that have been mentioned by other subsequent groups that have been there. James Anaya, the UN Special Rapporteur for Indigenous Issues, was just there this last week, and he received similar testimonies. All of this underscores the absolute crucial importance of an impartial investigation. On one hand, the Peruvian government has a responsibility to investigate, but I think the situation is so politicized, it's so, the tensions are so high that we probably need some sort of an alternative, parallel investigation that's going on, carried out by completely independent monitors.
What do you make of the outreach that President Garcia seems to be trying to reach out to indigenous people? He seems to be willing to engage a lot more. The Prime Minister Simon has said that he's willing to step down as well. So it seems that the government is listening, at least.
Well, that's only been in the last week or so, and if you look at the discourse of the government immediately following what happened in Bagua, it was actually very aggressive, and it was very much demonizing indigenous people and leaders. And it was only after the protests continued after that, it was only after an international outcry, and only after Alan Garcia's approval rating dropped from 30% to 21%. And these polls that are coming out now really show how unhappy people are with the way he's handled the situation. It's 84% in a poll that just came out yesterday are saying that they don't believe he handled it well. His disapproval rating is 76%, and 92% of people think that the government should have consulted with indigenous people, which is actually Peruvian law.
We had a mix of comments and questions from our internet and from viewers who sent it in advance. From Twitter, actually, we had one that came from a viewer who went by the name of Free the World, who writes in saying, "Economic development is the key to sustenance, survival and happiness. Indigenous land rights do not put food on the table." When you get that kind of view, how do you respond to that?
Well, look, we're not opposed to development, and indigenous people aren't opposed to development, but it has to happen within the law of the country, and it can't happen at the expense of the rights of local people. One of the things, as we're talking about the Amazon, beyond the economic development question, is the environmental question and climate change. And one of the things that we're incredibly concerned about is all of this development that's happening across the Amazon, not only in Peru, but in other parts of the Western Amazon and across the whole basin. 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, what are going to be the cumulative environmental impacts of all of the oil concessions, of the roads, of the mega projects, of the biofuels? You put all of this together, and it could very likely have a very detrimental environmental impact on the Amazon, and that's of tremendous concern. Scientists are talking about the Amazon potentially going over a tipping point after a certain amount of deforestation. If the Amazon goes into environmental collapse, the impact for Peru and development and for the rest of the world is going to be tremendous.
Let's squeeze in a call from Ali in the UK, who's joined us on the line. Ali, what would you like to ask?
It's not a question, it's a comment basically. It seems that the case of the Peruvian indigenous people in regards to the so-called development, which is, the question is, whose development is it? In terms of environmental impact, we've seen very much similar cases, for example, from the Delta region of Nigeria. We've also recently seen French companies exploiting the Niger area where many nomadic peoples live over thousands of years and they sustain their life.
Well, Ali, let me put this to Andrew Miller. I guess one of the key things, obviously, who's involved in this in terms of companies and what the government wants to achieve out of this. What would you suggest as the next step? What do you think is the next step for kind of finding some kind of balance where there's the economic development that the country does need to some degree, obviously, and the fact that the indigenous people want their rights upheld?
Well, the next step are to develop real processes of consultation with indigenous people. So the latest tensions have been over laws that were passed in the context of the free trade agreement between Peru and the United States. So the next step there is to develop policies and to really consult indigenous people in a meaningful way on those policies. That's at sort of a macro level. But you know, we see a lot of local tensions around specific development projects and extractive projects in these regions. So, you know, again, the problem is that there aren't meaningful ways in which indigenous perspectives are brought into that. And ultimately, according to international law, indigenous people really should be able to say yes or no whether or not they want these kinds of projects on their territories. You know, there's a recognition that indigenous people lived here long before the Peruvian state existed, and they're afforded special rights because of that. Interesting,
one of our viewers on Facebook, Eric Marshallberger in North Carolina here in the US, wrote in saying, all things considered, perhaps the US solution is helpful. Give indigenous people reservations. They govern, write the laws, and decide who and what can come to their land. Obviously, US experience also points out the flaws in the ideas. That must be addressed. Is that even feasible?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, to look at what's happening in the United States and try to transpose that to other situations, of course, you know, we have a long history of pretty poor policies vis-a-vis indigenous rights in the United States. So I wouldn't necessarily look to that as a model. I mean, what we do look to are different international standards that are emerging. You have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Peru actually led that process. So it's fascinating. On one hand, Peru's pushing forward this international declaration on indigenous rights, you know, maybe more for image reasons, but then on the ground, the way that they're actually playing themselves out, you know, isn't necessarily so positive. So they really need to take those international accords and their own obligations and their own law and actually implement it in these areas. Part of the challenge here is that legally the subsoil resources under their lands belong to the state. So you have sort of a tension between who controls the surface and who controls the subsurface. But I think these demonstrations, you know, the mobilization and the outcomes in Peru show that you really, in the long term, you really have to have buy-in from people.
Well, Andrew Miller, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we have to take a short break now. When we return, a look at the issue from the government's perspective with the Peruvian ambassador to the US. As we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. We'll be right back.